Nobody announces it. There's no meeting, no conversation, no moment where someone sits across from you and explains what's happening. It doesn't arrive with urgency or alarm. It arrives quietly, so quietly that most people don't recognize it as a decision at all. They experience it as a mood, a vague financial unease, a sense that things are fine but somehow not moving in the direction they once imagined. And then the year ends, and another begins, and the feeling persists, and the direction doesn't change. And eventually, the quiet becomes so familiar that it stops feeling like anything at all. This is how the most consequential financial decision most people ever make goes completely unnoticed. Not the decision to buy a house or take a new job or invest in a particular account. Those decisions are visible, they have paperwork, they have moments of deliberate choice. The decision that changes everything after 35 is different. It's not made in a single moment. It doesn't appear on any document. It's made gradually through a series of small, entirely rational-seeming choices that individually are unremarkable and collectively are irreversible. The decision is this: to stop treating your financial life as something being built and to start treating it as something being managed. That transition from building to managing is the quiet fault line that runs through the financial histories of most people in the second half of their working lives. And the reason it matters so much after 35 specifically, the reason that particular age is not arbitrary, has everything to do with the mathematics of time and the psychology of obligation, and the way those two forces converge around that decade into something that is very hard to reverse once it fully sets. To understand why 35 is the inflection point, you have to understand something about how the human mind relates to time in the context of money. In the 20s, time feels infinite. Not consciously, nobody at 25 sits down and thinks, I have unlimited time. But behaviorally, emotionally, in the way decisions get made and deferred, time operates as an inexhaustible resource. There is always more of it. The opportunity that passes will be replaced by another. The investment that didn't happen this year can happen next year. The risk that feels too large now can be taken when things are more stable. This relationship with time is not irresponsible. It reflects a genuine reality. 25-year-olds do have decades ahead of them. But the relationship produces a specific behavior pattern, consistent deferral. The financial choices that require courage, the ones that involve real risk and real commitment, keep getting moved to later when there's more money, later when there's more certainty, later when the moment feels right, and then 35 arrives, not catastrophically, not with any announcement that the rules have changed. But something has changed, and the mind at some level registers it. The obligations are real now. There are people depending on the income. The mortgage exists. The children exist. The career has a shape and momentum that would cost something significant to interrupt. The financial life that was once theoretical, once a plan, a possibility, a future that hadn't arrived yet, is now structural. It's load-bearing. Things are resting on it. And the mind, which is exquisitely sensitive to loss even when it's poor at calculating gain, begins to shift its orientation. The question changes. It stops being what could be built. It starts being what must be protected. That shift is the decision. And it happens so naturally, so rationally, so in keeping with real responsibilities and real stakes that almost nobody identifies it as a choice. It feels like growing up. It feels like maturity. It feels like finally understanding how things work. Here's what the mathematics actually say about 35, not as philosophy, but as arithmetic. The most powerful force in wealth building is compounding. Not investment strategy, not income level, not financial sophistication. Compounding. The mechanism by which returns generate their own returns, which then generate their own returns across decades of time. This is universally understood and consistently underestimated because the human mind is poorly designed to intuitively grasp exponential growth. We think in linear terms. We imagine returns adding on top of each other in equal increments. The actual behavior of compound growth, the acceleration in the later decades that makes the early decades almost unrecognizably small by comparison, doesn't feel real until someone puts the numbers in front of you. Put the numbers in front of you. Capital deployed at 25 has 40 years to compound before a standard retirement age. Capital deployed at 35 has 30 years. That 10-year difference is not a 10-year difference in outcome. Because of exponential growth, those 10 years, specifically those 10 years at the front of the timeline, can represent more total accumulated wealth than all the years that follow combined. The implication is almost too stark to absorb fully. The decade between 25 and 35, financially speaking, is not one of 10 roughly equal decades in a working life. It is the most consequential financial decade most people will ever have, not because of how much money moves through it, but because of how long the money deployed in it has to multiply. And it is precisely the decade in which most people are at their most financially constrained. Lowest income, highest proportion of debt, maximum life formation costs. The decade when capital is scarcest is the decade when capital is worth the most. That inversion is not accidental. It is structural, and the people who navigate it, who somehow find a way to deploy capital meaningfully in that decade despite all the constraints, carry a compounding advantage through every subsequent decade that cannot be fully replicated by effort, income, or intelligence alone. Those who don't arrive at 35 and make the shift, from building to managing. And the mathematics of what remains possible, while not hopeless, has changed in ways that never fully reverse. There's a pattern in the financial decisions people make in their mid-30s that deserves careful attention because it is so consistent, and so consistently invisible to the people inside it. Around this age, income has typically grown to a level where it feels genuinely meaningful for the first time. The lean years are over. The entry-level salaries and the student debt and the years of financial scraping are behind them. Real money is arriving, not wealthy money, but enough to matter, enough to feel like it should produce something different from what came before. And it does produce something. Just not what financial freedom requires. What the increased income of the mid-30s typically produces is an upgraded life, a larger home, because a family requires more space, because success deserves a certain setting, because the neighborhood matters for schools and community, and a dozen other entirely reasonable considerations. A better car, because reliability matters now that children are involved, because commutes are longer, because the old vehicle is aging. Travel that wasn't affordable at 25. Restaurants that weren't habitual at 23. A standard of living that expands to fill the income, as standards of living almost universally do, because the expansion feels like reward, and the mind interprets reward as rational. This is lifestyle inflation, and the reason it's discussed, so often without anyone actually changing their behavior in response to the discussion, is that lifestyle inflation doesn't feel like a financial mistake. It feels like the correct output of having worked hard and reached a certain level of success. The upgrades feel earned. They are earned in one sense of the word. The labor that produced the income was real, but they are also permanent. The Yawa lifestyle, once established at the new level, becomes the floor, and a rising floor continuously closes the gap between income and investment. The capacity to build wealth which requires that gap shrinks precisely as the income to fill it grows. This is the second quiet decision embedded in the mid-30s financial transition, not made consciously, but made nonetheless. The decision to define success as a standard of living rather than as a degree of financial freedom. And once that definition is established, the decisions that follow from it are internally consistent and financially consequential in ways that compound just, as surely as investments do, in exactly the opposite direction. Let's talk about something that almost never appears in financial discussions, despite being one of the most psychologically significant forces in the financial lives of people in this decade: identity. By 35, most people have constructed a social identity that is substantially supported by their financial life. Not just the income, the visible signals of the income, the neighborhood, the school district, the car in the driveway, the vacations that get discussed at dinner parties, the casual references to restaurants, to home renovations, to the kind of life that has enough margin in it to afford small luxuries without calculation. These are not superficial things. Social identity is a deep human need. The sense of belonging to a peer group, of being recognizable to the people around you as belonging to a certain class and register of life. This is psychologically foundational in ways that go back to the earliest human societies. Exclusion from the group, or the threat of it, activates the same neural pathways as physical danger. Social belonging is not a luxury. It is a survival mechanism operating in a modern context. What this means in practice is that financial decisions in the mid-30s are not made in a purely economic context. They are made inside a social context that exerts continuous, mostly invisible pressure toward maintaining a certain standard, a visible success, reducing the house, selling the car, declining the vacation. These are not just financial decisions. They are social statements. They communicate something about status, about trajectory, about whether things are going well or not. And the social cost of communicating the wrong thing, particularly in the social world of the professional middle class, where everything is coded and read carefully, is genuinely high. The mortgage that looks too large and purely financial. Terms often makes perfect social sense. The car that stretches the budget makes social sense. The private school that consumes the capital that could have been deployed differently makes social sense within the community that organizes daily life. These aren't irrational decisions. They're rational decisions made inside a social framework that has different objectives from a wealth-building framework. The tragedy, if it can be called that, is that the social framework and the wealth-building framework are almost perfectly opposed. What one rewards, visible consumption, demonstrable success, a life that looks prosperous from the outside, the other requires sacrificing. And most people, given the genuine human need for social belonging, choose the social framework without ever explicitly making the choice. They just live in the world they actually inhabit, responding to its real pressures, and discover years later that those pressures had been steering their financial life toward a specific outcome the whole time. There's a concept worth naming here, because it operates in almost every financial life after 35 and almost never gets called by its name: financial inertia. Objects in motion stay in motion. Objects at rest stay at rest. Financial patterns, once established, have a tremendous tendency to continue, not because they're optimal, not because they were consciously chosen, but because changing them requires energy, attention, friction, discomfort, and the willingness to disrupt a system that is currently functioning. And functioning, in the psychological sense, is deeply valuable. A functioning system is one that doesn't demand constant attention. It runs. The mind can direct its resources elsewhere. The mortgage payment, the contribution to the retirement account, the monthly bills, the subscription services, the recurring costs, these form a financial system that, once in motion, continues, largely automatically, and the automation is comfortable. It feels responsible. It feels like things are being handled. The direct deposits arrive, the payments exit, the account balances float within a predictable range, and the absence of crisis is interpreted as a sign that things are on track. What financial inertia conceals is the difference between functioning and progressing. A system can function perfectly, every payment made on time, every obligation met, every number in the expected range, while making no progress whatsoever toward financial freedom. The treadmill is a functioning system. The person on it is exerting real effort. The distance covered is exactly zero. After 35, financial inertia is the primary enemy of wealth building for most people. Not market crashes, not bad luck, not insufficient income, inertia. The system that was established in the years of early obligation continues to run, with minor adjustments and gradual increases, and the fundamental architecture of it, the ratio of spending to saving to investing, the relationship between income and freedom, the structure of how money moves and where it goes, never gets questioned. Because questioning requires energy, and energy is limited, and the system is functioning, and there are other things requiring attention. The people who build meaningful wealth after 35 are, almost uniformly, people who interrupted their financial inertia. Not necessarily dramatically, not always by leaving their jobs or making bold entrepreneurial moves. Sometimes by something much quieter, a single deliberate reconsideration of the underlying architecture, made once with clarity and intention, that reorganized how money flowed from that point forward. A decision that didn't look remarkable from the outside and didn't require constant reinforcement, but whose effects compounded through every subsequent year. That's the quiet decision the title is about. Not a dramatic act, a structural one. Here's the strange thing about the years after 35 in a financial life that hasn't made that structural change. They feel like preparation for something that doesn't quite arrive. The decade of the 30s has a particular psychological texture that people who've lived through it describe in strikingly similar terms: busy, committed, productive, moving. There is a constant sense of forward motion, career advancing, children growing, house improving, life filling in. The external evidence of progress is everywhere, and yet, underneath the motion, something is static. The fundamental financial position, the degree of actual freedom, the ratio of assets to obligations, the number of months that could be sustained without a salary, is not substantially different at 39 than it was at 35. The motion was real. The progress was real in the ways it was real, but the thing that was supposed to be building, the thing that eventually was supposed to deliver, didn't build. Because building wasn't the operating orientation. Managing was, maintaining was, sustaining the system was, and then 40 arrives and the texture changes again. Something becomes visible that the busyness of the 30s kept successfully obscured. The timeline has a shape now. Retirement is no longer an abstraction, it is a calculable distance, and the calculation is available to anyone willing to do it, and doing it produces a number that is either reassuring or not, and for the majority of people who do it honestly, it is not. The scramble that sometimes follows, the aggressive savings rate in the mid-40s, the sudden interest in investment that didn't exist 10 years earlier, the financial advisor appointments and the retirement projections, and the quiet anxiety underneath the Saturday morning conversations about money, this is the delayed recognition that the quiet decisions of the mid-30s had consequences that weren't visible when they were made. The compounding that could have been built in the decade between 35 and 45, that window specifically when obligations were real, but income had grown and time was still meaningful, is mostly gone, not entirely, but mostly. And what can be built in the 15 years before retirement, even with aggressive effort, is a different thing from what compound growth across 3 decades would have produced. Let's be precise about what the quiet decision actually looks like when someone makes it correctly. It is not a dramatic reorientation of an entire life. It is not the abandonment of comfort or the embrace of austerity. It is not a personality change or a philosophical conversion. It is a structural decision, a single, deliberate rearrangement of how money moves that doesn't require continuous willpower to maintain because it's built into the architecture rather than dependent on the behavior. What it looks like in practice varies. Sometimes it's treating investment as an obligation equivalent to a mortgage payment, non-negotiable, automatic, first out rather than last, before the spending that consumes everything else can reach it. Sometimes it's a deliberate decision, not to expand the lifestyle at the next income increase, to let the gap between income and spending widen rather than close. Sometimes it's the recognition that a specific large asset, a house with significant equity, an inheritance, a period of temporarily reduced expenses, represents a compounding opportunity that, if deployed rather than consumed, changes the trajectory of the next decade materially. The decision is structural rather than behavioral because structural decisions compound and behavioral decisions erode. A behavioral decision requires repeated recommitment. Every month, the willpower to not spend what could be invested, the discipline to maintain a standard of living lower than the income supports, the continuous active choice to defer gratification. Behavioral decisions are vulnerable to the bad month, the unexpected expense, the period of low motivation, the slow drift back toward the comfortable pattern. A structural decision happens once. The automatic investment happens before the money reaches the account where it can be spent. The commitment to a specific financial target gets built into the mortgage refinance rather than the monthly willpower budget. The mechanism runs without requiring recommitment because it was designed to run rather than depending on the person to run it. This is the difference between the people who succeed financially in the decade after 35 and those who don't. And it almost never comes down to income level or investment sophistication or financial knowledge. It comes down to whether the orientation shifted to structure or stayed in behavior, whether the money was architected or managed, whether the decision was made once, correctly, and built into how the system runs, or whether it was made repeatedly, imperfectly, in the daily and monthly contest between freedom and convenience that convenience almost always wins. There's something worth naming about why this decision is so hard to make at 35 specifically, beyond the obvious pressures of obligation and lifestyle. At 35, the future is still abstract and the present is completely concrete. The retirement that a structural financial decision is largely in service of is 25 or 30 years away. The things competing with that decision for the same money, the kitchen renovation, the better school, the car that doesn't require constant repair, the family vacation that is actually a memory being made, these are present and vivid and real in a way that a retirement 30 years away simply cannot be. Behavioral economists call this temporal discounting, the universal human tendency to value present rewards more than future ones, with the value of future rewards diminishing rapidly as they become more distant. $100 available now is worth more to the human mind than $100 available next year. $100 available in 30 years, however important rationally, barely registers against $100 available today. This is not a failure of rationality or imagination. It is the output of an evolutionary architecture that developed in an environment where the future was genuinely uncertain, where the bird in hand was genuinely worth 2 in the bush, where present resources were the only resources that could be relied upon. The wiring is ancient, and it works on modern humans regardless of their education level, their financial sophistication, or their genuine understanding of why the future matters. The specific cruelty of this wiring in the context of post-35 financial decisions is that the future moment at which the structural decisions of this decade matter most, retirement, financial autonomy, the capacity to stop, is precisely the most distant future that temporal discounting most powerfully T-values. The compounding advantage of investing at 35 versus 45 is real and mathematically significant and psychologically invisible, because the moment it makes itself felt is so far from the moment the choice has to be made that the mind cannot bridge the distance. And the things competing for that money are not far away at all. They are right here. They are what Thursday looks like and what the weekend is about and what the children are asking for. The present wins. Almost always, the present wins. Not because people are weak or short-sighted, but because they are built to be present-oriented, and the systems around them, the consumer economy, the social environment, the cultural messaging about what the good life looks like right now, are designed to exploit that orientation at every available opportunity. The people who make the quiet decision correctly are not necessarily smarter or more disciplined than those who don't. They share one characteristic more consistently than any other. At some point before 35, they genuinely confronted the mathematics of what the future would look like if they didn't. Not vaguely. Precisely. They ran the numbers. They looked at their current trajectory and followed it forward to a specific, concrete outcome. Not, I might not have enough, but at this rate, at 65, I will have this amount, which produces this annual income, which is this many years of this life. And they made the abstraction of retirement into something concrete enough to compete with the concrete reality of Thursday. That cognitive act, converting the distant and abstract into the present and specific, is what bridges the gap that temporal discounting creates. It doesn't override the psychology. It works with it. It makes the future real enough that the present-biased mind can weigh it seriously. Most people avoid this calculation, not out of laziness, out of something closer to self-protection, because the number done honestly is often not reassuring. And the mind, which is good at avoiding pain, is very practiced at finding reasons not to do the math, reasons to believe it will work out, reasons to wait until the numbers are better before looking at them carefully. The irony is that the worse the numbers, the more important it is to look at them. Because the worse the numbers, the more the structural decision matters. The less margin there is, the more consequential the architecture of how money moves becomes. Avoidance is most costly, precisely when the situation most requires attention. The quiet financial decision that changes everything after 35 isn't about a specific investment or a particular product or a strategy that someone's friend used. It's about something more fundamental than any of those things. It's about the moment a person decides, consciously and with real weight, what they are actually building their financial life toward. Not in the ambient, background sense in which everyone nominally knows they should be saving for retirement. In the specific structural, this is the target and this is how every dollar that flows through my life is now organized around reaching its sense. The moment the financial life stops being a thing that's happening and becomes a thing that's being constructed, that decision changes everything, not because of its immediate financial effect, which is often modest, but because of its cognitive effect. It reorganizes how financial information is processed. It changes which opportunities get noticed. It shifts the frame through which everyday financial choices are evaluated, not in a grinding, effortful, constant vigilance way, but in the deeper way that a changed orientation changes what you see before you decide to look. The person who has made that structural decision looks at a raise differently. They look at a bonus differently. They look at a spending opportunity differently, not because they're more disciplined, but because they're running a different internal calculation. The question has changed from, can I afford this, to what does this cost in terms of what I'm building? And those are not the same question. The first one is a management question. The second is an architecture question. And the answers are often completely different. After 35, the window doesn't close. That's important to say clearly, because the mathematics of compounding can be read as a counsel of despair if it's read carelessly, and that's not what it is. The window narrows. The cost of delay rises with every passing year, not linearly but exponentially, in the same mechanism that makes early investment so powerful. But 35 is not 65. There are decades remaining. There is compounding still available, still meaningful, still capable of producing outcomes substantially better than the alternative of continued inertia. What the window closing would look like is the absence of any decision. The management, orientation persisting through the 40s, through the 50s, into the final decade before retirement with the same financial architecture that was assembled in the 30s, still largely in place, still optimized for sustainability and social presentation rather than compounded growth. That outcome, for most people who approach it, arrives with a quality of regret that is specific and heavy. Not the regret of having taken risks that didn't work out, but the regret of having not decided. Of having been careful and responsible, and present and attentive, and arrived anyway at the same place as if none of it had been deliberate. The decision that changes everything is the decision to interrupt that trajectory. Not dramatically, not with a single bold act that transforms everything overnight. With a structural reorganization, done once, with clarity. The kind of clarity that only arrives when a person is willing to look honestly at where the current path leads and decide quietly and without performance that it leads somewhere different from where they intend to go. That decision is available. It is available today and tomorrow and every day that passes between now and the moment when the window genuinely closes. The only question that actually matters, underneath all the financial mechanics and all the mathematical detail and all the structural analysis, is whether the moment you make it has already passed or whether it is, quietly, right now.